There is an unfinished short story by Franz Kafka called Investigations of a Dog, and at its core, this story is about the pursuit of truth, and I think it has a valuable lesson for anybody doing research right now in search of truth. The protagonist of the story is an elderly dog who has spent his entire life trying to answer a relatively simple question about the world that he lives in. Where does the food that he eats come from? The story is basically the elderly dog telling us, the reader, about his lifelong quest to answer this question. The dog is a dedicated scholar and has rigorously applied the laws of dog science in his search for answers. The main point that Kafka was trying to make with the story, I think, is that the dog's investigations will be shaped by his species' intellectual frameworks and also by the previously existing body of dog science which he is building upon. The reader is told that dog science is remarkably simple. It teaches that the earth is the source of the food that dogs eat, and having laid down this hypothesis, it gives the methods and the rules that must be followed in order to attract different kinds of food in the best quality and the greatest abundance. Thanks to the efforts of previous dog scholars, dog science has developed a set of rules which, when followed, will ensure that all of dog society has enough food to eat. Dog science holds that in order to get food from the earth, dogs should regularly scratch and water it. They can also do rituals like singing and dancing, which will make food appear faster, and good quality food is more likely to appear at certain places and at certain times of day. These are universally accepted facts. All dogs can feed themselves and get enough to eat by following these laws set out by dog science. And our protagonist says, okay, fine, I accept that the earth gives us food. But what I want to know, the question which keeps him up at night, which he dedicates his whole life to trying to solve, is where does the earth get the food from? At first glance, this seems like a solid question, but if we examine it a little bit closer, we see that it's built upon an assumption which the dog never really questions. He assumes that the earth itself produces food. Because if the earth does not produce food, then it becomes impossible to ask the question, where does the earth get the food from? And by starting with this underlying assumption, the dog's entire inquiry becomes constrained. This question that he poses only really works or makes sense within the very particular frameworks and boundaries of dog thought that he has just adopted or inherited. And this is very much like our own efforts to understand the world, which often operate within inherited systems of thought. Our assumptions, our perspectives, our intellectual boundaries not only shape what kind of questions we pose, but they also limit the kind of knowledge we are capable of producing. If we keep drawing this parallel to our own research efforts, we, much like the elderly dog, often skip over questioning the fundamental assumptions of our research and just skip straight to asking questions. We work within paradigms, what Thomas Kuhn has described as a set of common beliefs and agreements shared between scientists about how problems should be understood and addressed. Just as the dogs take for granted that food comes from the earth, we also take for granted the intellectual paradigms that structure our knowledge. The limits of knowledge, what we cannot see. Returning to the story, the dog tells us that nobody he ever asks this question to, where does the earth get the food from, is willing to engage with him, even though there are some pretty obvious inconsistencies between what dog science teaches and what dogs actually do in practice to get food. If dog science's hypothesis is correct, if scratching and watering the earth is what you need to do to get food, then you would expect food to appear on the ground. But in practice, the protagonist tells us that most of the food which is discovered on the ground falls from above. He says that they snap up most of their food before it has even touched the ground at all. Whether the earth draws one kind of food out of itself or whether it calls food from the sky makes no essential difference to dog science, but the protagonist does share one more interesting thing that he notices. Dog science claims that scratching and watering and also ceremonies like dancing and singing should be directed to the earth, right, to the soil. But this elderly dog notices that most dogs, when they perform these food summoning ceremonies, actually direct their gaze upwards. They look to the sky. That the dogs look to the sky instead of to the earth, as dog science tells them to, when they are actually summoning food, is an inconsistency within the system of thought that governs how dogs understand where their food comes from. And ultimately, the fatal flaw in dog knowledge, as you may have guessed, is that the earth does not produce the food. The thing is, in the story, humans are the source of food that dogs eat. Dogs just cannot perceive them. When developing their framework that food comes from the earth, dog scholars never stop to consider the existence of human beings, because why would they if they don't know they exist? Their entire structure of thought makes the idea of human beings completely unnecessary. Dogs are unable to ask certain questions because their conceptual frameworks make those questions invisible. Ultimately, the knowledge that dogs produce is constrained not only by their intellectual frameworks, but also by their perceptual limitations. In the end, despite being able to prove that there are inconsistencies between accepted knowledge and what he has observed, the dog is unable to arrive at a satisfactory answer to his question. He spends his whole life searching for where the earth gets the food from, and he can never ever figure it out. The protagonist is a dedicated scholar who collects data and conducts their research as rigorously as dog science tells them to. He's also aware that he is making some fundamental error somewhere. He realizes that there must be something wrong with the way he's trying to approach the question, but nevertheless, he still can't figure it out. The true reality of where food comes from remains hidden from him because human beings remain beyond his conceptual limits and beyond his perceptual limits as well. Can you see the metaphor taking shape? Our scientific frameworks are built within the boundaries of what we can observe and what we can conceptualize. Human beings have their own intellectual, cognitive, and perceptual limits, which restricts us in our search for absolute truth, even though we don't like to acknowledge it. Absolute truth, in the sense of something which exists independent of human interpretation or observation, seems unreachable. Every being, whether human or dog, can only comprehend truth within the limits of its perceptions and its experiences. But then this also leads to an interesting question: does absolute truth matter? In our research, we tend to believe that with careful planning, rigorous methodology, and to be frank, our own human brilliance, we can fully know the unknown. The belief that if we look hard enough, we can see all things that we seek to has been a feature of scientific thought for hundreds of years. One of the most important changes that led to the scientific revolution was the idea that human knowledge could extend indefinitely. However, our own human efforts at research are also constrained by observational and experiential limitations. We are inevitably limited by our own subjective lenses when trying to understand objective reality. Much like the elderly dog, we face a challenge, maybe even an impossibility, in trying to access absolute truth. But the whole point of this is not just to throw our hands in the air and say, oh, whatever, do away with science and the search for truth. Let's all just scratch the earth and hope it gives us food. It's more an invitation to reflect on the nature of knowledge as people, as scholars, who have taken it upon themselves to produce it. While we may never attain an absolute and final truth, that doesn't render research meaningless. On the contrary, research is about continual refinement. It's about getting closer and closer, even if you can never quite arrive. Does it really matter if we cannot develop a knowledge of absolute truths? Or, to put it a different way, is the dog's understanding of where food comes from really so problematic? After all, dogs have a set of laws and rules which were developed based on data they observed and gathered during research. All the dogs following these rules can feed themselves. Dog society has enough to eat, even though it is not capturing the absolute truth, the absolute reality of their situation. Is it really inadequate? Research just works that way. We may not be able to arrive at absolute truth, but we can arrive at approximations of the truth. Donald Hebb, the psychologist, said that a good theory is one that holds together long enough to get you to a better theory. Our research works more or less within our frameworks, and when it doesn't, we develop better frameworks. There's no need to lament our inability to arrive at absolute truth. Our knowledge might be incomplete and fragile. It might be subject to change and revision instead of absolution and finality, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have pragmatic value. It still works for us.